Good afternoon. I'm Anuj Mehrotra. I'm Dean of the School of Business at the George Washington University, and I am delighted to welcome you to this first episode of George Talks Business in Spring. Today, our distinguished guest is Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. Welcome to the show again, and thank you for returning to the show, Mayor.
Well, thank you, Dean. It's my pleasure to be here with you, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. So, Mayor Bowser, the first time you were on this show was in fall of 2019, and you were at the beginning of your second term. And I was wondering if you would ever run for a third term. We wanted to have you back on the show in fall last year for you to use this platform to announce your candidacy. But, oh well, that did not work out, but you have announced your candidacy for the third term. I also recall you mentioning that you love your job as the mayor of your hometown. This is a tough job, and most would consider that this is for somebody who would be a glutton for punishment. Tell us what makes you love this job.
Well, some days it feels like I'm a glutton for punishment, and that's why, I love it, and I love it so much. Especially, it's a hard job any day, but especially during a global pandemic, economic tsunami that hit us following the pandemic. And weeks of unrest in our communities related to racial justice reckoning our country is experiencing. And so all the while, I worked with my team, wonderful DC residents and businesses. We stood shoulder to shoulder together to weather the storms that have come our way. And now we're all putting our heads together to plan our city's comeback from the ravages of COVID-19.
Great. So I think we have received so many questions from our audience today, and many of them are along the lines of what you are talking about. So we'll go and try and get to them, as many of them as we can today. But you mentioned leading in times of the COVID, in times of the Black Lives Matter movement, in times of the insurrection of the Capitol and associated challenges, and many others. It feels like you're always on the knife's edge. So you must have certain guiding principles in your leadership. Could you tell us a little bit about what guides your leadership, what guides your decision making?
Well, absolutely. And certainly we lay out, and I laid out at the beginning of my service in the district, what our core values are. And that's that we work hard, that we're creative, that we tell the truth, and that we serve with integrity. We also base all of our leadership in initiatives and investments on our DC values of really supporting a strong and diverse community where people who work hard will get a fair shot in our city and in our economy, and that's how we serve. More than that, in times of crisis, in non-crisis times, I have always stressed to my team that we have to deal with the crisis at hand, but we always have to keep an eye on our agenda and making sure that it advances no matter what.
So, Mayor Bowser, during this last couple of years, especially during the pandemic, universities, for example, have had some very difficult decisions to make and issues in higher education. But I also know that the presidents of the universities, the deans of the universities, they seem to have each other to be able to talk through some of these issues and bounce off ideas. We have been receiving many questions around some very difficult topics that you have faced as a leader. Especially with and also many of the cities around the country are facing issues like homelessness, increased crime rate, and are battling on views on mask mandates. Do you also have this network of mayors that you talk to each other? Could you walk us through how you come up with this kind of a group to be able to come up with decisions, and does that help?
It absolutely does help. And you're right, Dean, that there are, in times like this, it is helpful to talk to people who are walking in the same path and dealing with very similar questions, and to have that group of people to bounce things off of. I also think, and there's been a lot written about kind of what mayors have gone through over the last 20 months. We're dealing with a pandemic that was kind of all of the issues were pushed down to the local level. In our case, pushed directly down to our city, county, state. We also had issues that I think a lot of mayors hadn't encountered before, or certainly in the level of intensity. We're dealing with some of these issues. There are always issues where people are happy with the decision, and there will be some people who aren't. In the last couple of years, we saw really disaffected people show up at our homes, threaten our families, and disrupt the kind of normal order of making decisions. So that's been hard on a lot of mayors. You saw some mayors bow out of running again, for instance, and people had to take a long, hard look and make sure that they had the energy to proceed. And that's why it kind of goes back to your very first question. You have to love it. And the decision for me was, while we've gotten a lot done, in 7 years, almost 8 years of our agenda. We focused on homelessness. We're having success. We focus on equitable economic development, where we're having success. We've been very focused on our kids in school. We're having success, but there's still so much more that we can get accomplished in a third term.
So we'll come back to leadership and some of this decision making, but you started by talking about the economic recovery, and that is your prime number one consideration. So tell us, what is your number one priority when focusing on the recovery and bringing prosperity back to DC?
Well, I have to say, as tough as it was to close down a city in March of 2020, I mean, everything, all of your economic activity, our universities, our schools, our tourism, our employment sector in our downtown, which is largely driven by large employers, the federal government being the largest. So all of those things were tough decisions. We had a systematic process with a reopen advisory committee that advised us on all of our sectors, including the university sector, and we were very proud to have that level of participation. So turning it back on, it has been much harder. And we know now that people are thinking differently about work, how they work, the types of things that can get done and accomplish in a virtual environment. And I think when we step back from this, we're going to learn that not everything we figured out during COVID was bad. In fact, some of it is going to stick around. We, for example, know that there's going to be some level of virtual work and that's going on. And one of our primary areas of focus now is, what does that mean for our downtown, for our central employment district? And so we're looking at a variety of issues, from innovation districts that I know GW is very interested in. We're looking to see how we can have more housing downtown, and if some of those commercial office buildings will be repositioned into housing. We're also very excited about repositioning some public space. A good thing during the pandemic was people figured out that we could share our space, and that cars are great, but they shouldn't have all of the public space. We transformed Franklin Park in the Central Business District during this time. We've used some of our street parking for streeteries, so people could keep their businesses open and DC residents employed and people eating. And so those are some of the ideas, but how we reimagine our central employment district is top among them.
Well, thank you. And you mentioned something which is certainly very exciting and interesting from our perspective as well as GW, which is the Penn West Equity and Innovation District that you talked about just now. I've been talking to my colleagues, and there is a lot of excitement about it, particularly because GW is right at the edge of the proposed Innovation District area. So can you tell us a little bit about the vision for Innovation District in DC? What are some of the challenges and key success factors in your opinion?
Well, it's very important us to, we think, to brand some areas, and especially when we can leverage institutions that are already there. So the Golden Triangle bid has been very focused on how it can reposition some of its commercial buildings in the corridor. So systematically, we've been investing in the public sphere there with changes to the built environment. But it's key that we're able to attract employers and that the city be a partner in that. So we think that Innovation District lets employers know that this is the caliber of worker that you can attract. These are the institutions that are already there that will provide some synergy among employees and businesses. And it also lets them know that the city is in. We know that cities have to be a part of the economic development calculus of all employers as they're thinking about where they're locating and where their employees want to live. And as part of my last budget, I included, for example, a vitality fund that would allow the city to be at the table with employers. We know that this is kind of the time of great movement. People are thinking about where they want to work, but employers are also thinking about their space needs. And we want DC to always be attractive in those considerations.
So thank you. And I think we are very excited, of course, of the prospect of the research and the opportunities for our students because of the agency and us to be in a position to play a role in that at GW. And I know that there are three pillars around which we are thinking about the Innovation District of Health, Government, and Education Tech. And then all of them are certainly very important. But one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which you mentioned earlier today, have been central issues in almost every CEO's mind in the last couple of years, especially. Can you talk a little bit about how you have seen these conversations evolve? And through the lens of innovation and recovery, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion represent to you?
Well, I think what we have definitely seen, especially corporate America, become very focused on its role in the racial reckoning that our nation has experienced. And so it's more than criminal justice, it's also economic justice and how people have more opportunity in our nation for good paying jobs, to start businesses, to buy homes. And those are all the key pillars to, changing the trajectory, especially for African Americans in our country. We've seen some larger businesses come into the district and really have a community focus. I'm thinking of one bank in particular who hadn't built a new branch in years and now has expanded pretty significantly in the district. And they have a new model of community banking where they're going into communities, they hire a community manager, and they really look for opportunities to help people who are thinking about starting a business or owning a home. And that's very significant. We've seen big philanthropy come into the district and make some key investments, and we expect to see more at some of our universities and research institutions. They've all been pretty focused on us, and we're hopeful that we'll see more of that. We've also seen the focus on COVID and the stark disparities, especially early on in the pandemic, that we saw. For example, African Americans in our city made up over 70% of the deaths related to COVID were African Americans. And so what does that mean for how we invest in making people have better access to quality health care, to quality housing, quality education, and job opportunity. So that's where we've seen it. In terms of how we express a commitment to diversity and equity in the city, It's really hard to point to one thing because, quite frankly, I think all of the investments that the city makes is focused on how every person, regardless of where they live or what their background is, has access to quality housing, a great education, and amenities right in their own neighborhood. But still, we're focused. We've created an Office of Racial Equity that looks at our investments to make sure that they are advancing opportunity in the city for everyone.
Well, certainly, very well said. And I think supporting minority-owned business, small businesses in DC is, of course, also near and dear to our heart. We are really proud of our partnership as a school with the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development to provide training for the local entrepreneurs in DC through a program called Elevate. I'm not sure if you are familiar with that or not, but I would love to hear a little bit about the DC government's initiative supporting local small business owners.
Well, you may know that we have a local law called Certified Business Enterprises Law that requires DC to spend a portion of our $18 billion budget with our small and local businesses. And one thing I'm very proud of is that when I came into office in 2015, we were spending as a government about $337 million with our CBEs, with our small and local businesses. This past year, we spent over $1 billion with our small and local businesses. Even in our COVID response, where we spent over $4 billion, we had a CBE goal of about 50% of certain purchases, and we were able to hit those goals as well. And so the way that we have done that is to make sure that everybody out there in the procurement world knows what we're buying from year to year. It's really kind of simple. It's blocking and tackling. And we prioritize and we preference working with our own businesses. You'll also hear, I know, in working with small businesses, that there's some systemic things that have to be addressed, including access to capital and access to bonding. And in supporting mentor and protege relationships that allow smaller businesses to get experience so that they can become larger businesses. We're also been very concerned. A lot of times, the United States Conference of Mayors is in town. A lot of mayors are in town, and they frequently tell me, "Oh, it's so much development going on in DC. What are you doing? How are you doing it?" And it's true. We're growing, still a growing city. Even during a pandemic, we've been able to keep our construction going. But there are very, very few African American owned firms that are leading those construction projects. So we created something called the Equity RFP. That requires majority ownership of development projects. So I'm very proud that is now advancing in our administration.
Great. So I know we have a very limited time, and I know you have a hard stop, and I appreciate your time today. But I do want to get to some student questions who they have submitted, and I wanted to ask you those questions today. So I'm a decision scientist, and I study decision making under uncertainty. But I'm not sure I understand decision making under pressure, whether it is pressure coming from monetary pressure or pressure from making the right calls for public health. And the students, one of the questions that is submitted is, what is it like to be in the hot seat to make those kind of decisions under pressure, where if something goes wrong, a lot of harm could come out of your decision making?
That's a great question, and I feel like because of the kind of the great team of decision makers that I have around me, those decisions aren't as hard as you may think. Because I have this wonderful leadership at the Department of Health who were extremely prepared to deal with this pandemic. They have great epidemiologists and data scientists who, once they kind of pull together a recommendation, the decisions can be easy. I say that even though we've had some tough ones, because as you mentioned, there are trade-offs. There's not just one. The public health this information may be clear, but their economic impacts, their social impacts to those decisions as well. So when there can be such significant trade-offs, you also have to be prepared to address what you may have cost from one decision. And that's what we saw in this pandemic, that we had to, especially early on, make some clear-cut decisions. I will say that the decisions to close or to intervene in the early months were much easier than the decisions about how you reopen and roll off of those interventions. And so they have become more complicated, but still we have relied on science. We have relied on other data, whether it be economic data, that also influences some of the other investments that we've made during this response.
Great. So as Dean, Mayor Bowser, I'm proud to share that we have received high marks in major rankings for being a leader in enrolling women in business education. And one of our students, Elena, she's asking, what advice do you have for a woman coming into a leadership role? And Leila, of course, his follow-up question, which is around the same area, is what is one piece of advice you would give someone wanting to build their leadership skills?
Well, I think with a lot of leadership skills, and every skill that I have in leadership has been taxed over the last 2 years, let me just say. And you have to be well prepared. You also have to be confident in your decisions, and you have to be responsible for them. To look back to the question that you just asked. But I frequently tell people who are building their skills to get a lot of different experiences, volunteer for activities, volunteer for various groups. My dad used to tell me, like, if you're going to be in the group, you might as well be the president. So if you aspire to executive leadership, then you have to practice it. And you can do that in a lot of different activities. But that's what I would suggest. Also, a lot of leadership and that I have really been that has been very critical in an emergency is communication, and being able to clearly communicate to the people that you're leading. And I'm sure you recognize this, Dean, that we've used to talking to people face to face, having meetings, not communicating with a mask on, all of those things we have been challenged over the 20 months to figure out. But there is no substitute from a leader being able to communicate the vision, what needs to happen, how we need to pivot, and to the people who have to actually go out there and get the job done. So I would say to everybody who wants to be a leader, whether it's in corporate or political or whatever you're doing, you have to practice, and there's no substitute for it. So get involved in some of your campus groups, get involved in other advocacy groups, political groups, and practice your leadership.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor Bowser, for your time. I really appreciate it, for your determined hard work for the city and for the community. And we want to wish you the very best for your re-election, and we hope you will return to the George Talks